Before the advent of that regime, Dresden, where I was born, had about 6,000 Jews, 1% of the city's total population. 3/4 of them were Eastern European, mainly Polish and Romanian, of origin, as were my parents. My father was the Orthodox rabbi of a mainly Polish congregation. In 1935, the Nazis enacted the Nuremberg race laws. This is by way of prelude to the Holocaust, which deprived Jews of citizenship, barred them from many professions, and prohibited all intimate contact with Gentile women as race defilement. These laws were followed by many other legal disabilities and anti-Jewish ordinances. Among these were the following, and this is a short list. Wearing the yellow Star of David, standing in the back on trams, no sitting on park benches, no telephones or radios, no kosher slaughtering, handing over gold and silver objects, including candelabra. Jewish children were barred from public schools. Israel or Sarah were added to Jewish first names. Anti-Semitic cartoons appeared in the daily Der Stürmer, and we have recently seen some echoes of that. In October 1938, Jews who were Polish citizens were deported to Poland. Since they made up most of the membership of my father's congregation, their deportation spelled the end of it. A Jewish student in Paris, whose parents were among the deported, assassinated a German embassy official in Paris. The Nazis responded with Kristallnacht, during which synagogues throughout Germany were burned to the ground, including the main synagogue in Dresden. I was then 8 years old. Jewish shops were boycotted, then plundered. Many Jewish men were interned in Buchenwald and other camps. Jews were attacked on the street, and some were killed. In 1940, I was beaten by 2 teenage Hitler youth. I still have a scar to remind me of it. It was the end of normal classes in our Jewish school, which was soon closed down altogether. Like most Jews, we tried to emigrate. Admission to the US was limited by the national origins quota system. Certificates for Palestine were severely restricted by the British White Paper of 1939. Entry to a number of Latin American countries cost a lot of money, which we didn't have. We almost got a visa to the US, but it was blocked at the last moment by State Department obstruction. On January 20, 1942, our family, parents, brother, sister, and I, was deported to a ghetto in Riga, Latvia. It was the date of the Wannsee Conference, where the final solution of the Jewish question was decided. The ghetto had been set up after the Germans occupied the Baltic countries. Ghetto inmates came from all over Germany and former Austria and Czechoslovakia. Our days were marked by hunger, sickness, work details, shootings, public hangings, and periodic roundups of Jews for final disposal. Some were sent to nearby forests, and dug their own graves before being shot. Others were dispatched in gas vans, and still others shot by mobile army killing units. At first, the old and sick were disposed of. Then children under 10. On November 2, 1943, the ghetto, whose population was already decimated, was dissolved in a final selection process. One group of inmates was chosen for transport to forced labor camps, the remainder for extermination. Our family was sent to the Army Clothing Depot, a forced labor camp near Riga. I had to push carts on rails carrying used uniforms taken from wounded or fallen German soldiers for fumigation and repair. It was a 14-hour work day, and sometimes 15 hours. I was almost shot for sabotage, which consisted of reading soldiers' letters found in the uniforms. I got a reprieve. I was flogged by a Latvian volunteer guard. In late summer 1944, we were shipped to concentration camp Stutthof, close to the Baltic Sea. Built in 1939 as a camp for Polish political prisoners. Stutthof was transformed into a concentration camp when it opened its gates to Jews. It had electrified fences all around it and between the men's and the women's camps. Less than 2% who entered there survived the gassings, starvation, sickness, body lice, and the random beatings and shootings by Germans and Ukrainian guards. On January 25, 1945, as the Soviet army came close, Stutthof was being vacated. My father was taken ill and was forced back to barracks, where he died. My brother and I were sent to join a death march in a western direction during a snowstorm. Only a very small number survived this march. My brother and I were picked up in the evening by a German soldier and taken to a barn to spend the night. The next morning, we were deposited at Proust, a satellite camp of Stutthof, about 10 miles south of Danzig or Gdansk. This camp already held a dozen young boys, but it was populated largely by Hungarian Jewish women who had been transferred from Auschwitz. My brother died there on March 7, 1945. 2 weeks later, the camp was liberated by Soviet army soldiers. And my ordeal, that is after 3 years, 2 months of total incarceration, was ended. A few days later, I made my way to Łódź, the lodge where a Jewish community had already opened. I was sent to an orphanage that housed children who had been in camps or in hiding. And 2 or 3 of them actually had spent time in Siberia. 3 months later, on June 11, June 10th. In a fortuitous combination of circumstances, I was reunited with my mother and sister in a village near the Baltic Sea, not far from where they had been liberated. We spent nearly a year in Poland, where incidentally we found out that neither my grandmother in Poland nor any of my Polish relatives had survived. And we spent several months in a displaced persons camp in West Berlin. We arrived in the United States on December 13, 1946. I came to Boulder in 1965 to accept a position at CU. During my tenure there, I did not publicize my Holocaust experiences. My survival was not a matter of heroism or special merit, but of pure luck. I represent the experiences of a typical ghetto and camp survivor. And, I should say, is typical survival guilt. Thank you.
We'll take some moments now to meditate together using any good wordless melody. Words cannot hold what we hear, but perhaps the frequency of our song together can help us to absorb and to hold together these tragic and traumatic memories being brought to us this evening. Please join me. I would like to invite now Elise Berlin, second generation perspective, then and now.
everybody. And I want to thank Havera for inviting me to speak. 15 years ago, I co-produced a film about children of Holocaust survivors. The film is about intergenerational transmission of trauma, which back then wasn't as popular a topic as it is now. I'm glad this topic is of interest to so many and is now being spoken of quite often. As a child of a Holocaust survivor myself, I was asked to speak from that perspective. The documentary that was made was titled, Then and Now, Children of Holocaust Survivors Speak. It reflected upon our lives, hopes, hang-ups, and frustrations. My perspective was different then, and my now keeps morphing and challenging me in how I feel about my role as a child of a Holocaust survivor. 20 or 30 years ago, I didn't really feel I had a role in the greater society regarding the Holocaust. The now, when I was 30 years old, then 45 years old, was different than my now of 60-something. The obvious difference for me is up until recently my mother was alive, but she is not now. May 25th is the one-year anniversary of her death. So giving this talk not only honors her memory, but gives me a chance to think about what my now is really about. Who am I now that my mother has died? And in what way do I need to speak for her now that she is no longer here? 4 years ago, during the 70th anniversary of the liberation of many concentration camps, a strange thought crept into my head. The thought was, hypothetically, how will we know when the last survivor dies? Is anyone keeping track? To my knowledge, no stateside organization involved with survivors knows that my mother died. So what organization will be keeping track of her death or the many other deaths of survivors who will be reaching the ends of their lives? The German government may be aware of her death, since her bank account closed and her war reparations checks that tried to compensate her for her slave labor during her incarceration, will be returned back to the German government. But how will they handle and disseminate this information? And what does it mean for me and the world when the last survivor is gone? Just think about that. Not one person left that experienced the Holocaust from a first-hand perspective. I found the thought chilling when it occurred to me 4 years ago, and even more chilling now that the denial of the Holocaust seems to be more prevalent under this government administration. I fear greatly as to how our world will perceive the Holocaust in 20, 30, or 50 years' time. Between 2016 and 2017, according to the FBI, hate crimes against Jews rose by 37%. We're all saddened by Pittsburgh and now San Diego. Holocaust education is mandated in some form by only 17 states in our country. According to the Washington Post, 2/3 of American millennials surveyed in a recent poll cannot identify what Auschwitz is. According to a study released on a previous Holocaust Remembrance Day, it was found that the knowledge of the genocide that killed 6 million Jews during World War II is not, to use the study's words, robust among American adults. There is no international standard for talking about the Holocaust. In 2015, UNESCO attempted to map the status of the Holocaust in secondary school level history and social studies curricula and textbooks around the world. There are many countries that we may expect would not talk about the Holocaust, but shockingly, the following countries provide none or limited Holocaust education: Norway, Iceland, Mexico, Morocco, China, New Zealand, Thailand, and Japan. My mother wasn't particularly vocal about her experience, but on occasion, when asked by a neighbor doing a school project or an event at our synagogue, she would say a little about it. Now the role has been passed down to me by default, by her death. This role is one that I am only coming to understand and to get a sense of the enormity of the task. But when I think of the horror of what my mother went through and the importance of never forgetting, I am reminded of the words of Hillel the Elder, loosely paraphrased, if not now, when? And if not me, then whom? When I was asked to talk about my mother from a daughter's perspective, I had to think about which daughter I would be in this moment. There's the dutiful daughter who obliged my mother in almost every way. There's the angry daughter who never had her needs met, who felt out of sync with typical American children, living typical American lives. The sad daughter who never delved too deeply into her family history for fear of rocking the boat and now feels incomplete, as if she only exists as part of a family of 4 people, no ancestors, as if the existence of grandparents, uncles, aunts was a vague concept that practically didn't apply if only in yard-side candles. The proud daughter who knows she comes from strength and determination, a person born of the will to live under the most dire of circumstances, or is she simply the lucky daughter, whose fate has allowed her to come into being simply because sheer chance and luck allowed, a product of second-generation survivor guilt? My mother Franya's death resonates with sadness for me, and it was harder than I anticipated. I believe I had a significant and maybe even codependent attachment to her. Our relationship, while often rocky, was extremely close. As a child of an immigrant family, I grew up faster than other groups since it became incumbent upon me to be a translator and interpreter of American customs and traditions. My mother had no idea how to bake cupcakes, and the PTA was a new concept. She might not have let me wear my skirts short or my brother's hair too long without long involved fights. My brother and I were often guided by our parents with a shtetl mentality, but we were living and growing up in the age of Aquarius. While most American teens were becoming liberated in the 60s, we were trying to do this while managing parents that often needed our guidance and attention and were often deeply wounded people. I needed to excel in school and be a perfectly wonderful child, since upsetting my parents because of what my mother went through was unacceptable and on a nonverbal level not allowed. At school, writing essays or taking math tests was a discovery I had to make on my own. Since my mother's education was abbreviated, helping me with homework wasn't really possible. That's not to say she didn't educate herself and become a very well-read person. Over time, she certainly did, but only in certain subjects. She learned to speak English perfectly, but with a very thick Polish accent. And my whole life, when she met friends of mine, the first question would inevitably be, "Where is your mother from?" Perhaps the most difficult part of being a child of a Holocaust survivor is not feeling fully entitled to your own emotions and feelings. As it was always important to give the impression that everything was always okay, it left me without an understanding ear to share my challenges of adolescence and my trials of growing up in an American society. My mother was unskilled in guiding me, and of course I never wanted her to see my pains of adolescence, since it was inconceivable for her to think my childhood could have trials. Her position was self-centered and insensitive, and I quickly learned it was almost impossible for a survivor to unlearn these negative traits unless they had keen observational skills in regard to themselves. But how could they even develop a skill set like this, having been disrupted to such a great degree, and so often, and at such a young age, and for so long? There was a distinctly understood, but never acknowledged training to never compete with my mother's sorrow. And this made for a disturbed childhood. I've spent a lot of time unraveling this process that wasn't intentional or even understood by my mother, as it was a byproduct of the Holocaust. Our family, like many survivor families, was small. With little extended family, there was a reliance and a dependence we had on each other that was stifling. My mother would say, we can't trust anybody else. And because of her understandable feelings of lack of safety and security, my brother and I became her world, and she became ours. As a child, my report cards were always excellent, but the teachers frequently commented on the cards, your child asks so many questions, or your child seems very worried about things. My mother's constant fear of daily actions going wrong not only presented itself literally as constant questions to me, such as, where is your purse? Did you forget your purse? To more subtle indicators, such as her desire that I should not go to someone's house for a sleepover party with the excuse that I won't get a good night's sleep. Of course, that is the intention of a sleepover party for young girls. But her fear very well could have been I might not come back home to her. As I became an older teenager, my responsibility for my mother grew, and it was assumed that I would be her companion whenever needed, and that felt like I was being her spouse or her mother. I had the responsibility my whole life. When she died, I had the sense of not only losing my mother, but of losing my child. When I think about my mother and her survivor friends who survived the unthinkable, there was no way for them to survive without some degree of being damaged, psychologically damaged. Whether disillusioned and therefore rejecting God, or embracing God with a seriousness and commitment because of the belief that they were saved, there is still undeniably myriad shattered parts of the person who became wife and husband, mother and father. As I grew older and could identify my mother's suffering, I was constantly striving to fix what was broken. Was this role foisted on me, or did I subconsciously take it on? This is hard to say. Now that my mother is deceased, this tikkun, or reparation, is an example of trying to fix what can no longer be fixed. Did I fail her? If I could bring her back from her death, this might be the ultimate act of reparation, but could it heal her past? It is only through my connection with the divine that I hope she is repaired in Olam Haba, in the next world, as a path to my salvation and for my senseless worrying about her welfare to finally be out of my hands. This is the day we remember those we lost, and we honor their memory, as well as honoring and learning from our existing survivors, who are last witness to a horrifying aspect of human history. It would be all too easy to say, that was so long ago, and that could never happen again, or that we would never allow such a thing. But sadly, I'm not feeling optimistic about who we are and what we easily disregard. I'm sure each of us has had a moment where we felt strongly about doing something for a cause, only to bury that feeling of action in busyness, or hope that an organization will do something, or simply conveniently forgetting how effective we were in that moment. I am guilty of this. So when I was asked to say something for this memorial, I felt that I should be able to say something that spoke to this moment. Because in the next 10 years, more or less, the second generation, my generation, will be all that remain. Not only does the second generation hold the trauma, but we hold the torch. My first-hand knowledge of what my mother went through will be the closest thing, aside from books and movies, that we will have to being able to tell their stories and bear their testimony. And if you still have a survivor in your life, please be brave and ask them to share with you their stories and ask them how they most want to be remembered. Take notes, take pictures, write it all down. I recently met John and Amy Prigelman, who started a nonprofit called Kavod. Kavod raises funds to provide emergency aid to survivors in need. In the United States, of the 80,000 survivors left, 30% live in poverty and don't have enough food. These survivors often have no extended family and no one to look after them in their final years. Kavod was created to help these survivors live their remaining years with dignity and honor. I am proud that I have been helping Kavod in my mother's memory. After losing my mother, I lost the ability to defer the responsibility of being a witness and a voice for those who lost everything, those that were witness to the unimaginable. I am hoping that after today's events, you'll think of ways, however small or not so small, you can do your part. Thank you for helping me commemorate this subject, one so close to my heart.
And if you're a Chaver Rabbi, please come up to the bima.